Let's just talk a little bit more about tariffs, because I think anybody hoping that he was going to go soft on the tariff issue would be disappointed by that speech. He's talked about an external revenue service, a completely new branch of the US government to kind of get all this money coming in from around the world, which is going to make America rich again. It doesn't sound like we are going to be in an easy position to be cut out of this. This seems to be a kind of universal policy that he's applying to everybody, doesn't it, Liam?
I'm not sure. I mean, the section on tariffs was actually a lot smaller than I thought it was going to be. And I noticed it was one of the sections of his speech where the applause was much lighter. In fact, I'm not sure there was any at all. There certainly weren't standing ovations for that point, which might tell you exactly where Congress is. But look, I mean, there's a real danger of this. If there are tariffs on British exports, that is going to be pretty bad for our economy. It could halve the rate of growth, put up inflation, put up interest rates. And the consequence of that is that our defence spending will be cut by up to a couple of £1 billion a year by 2030. And so we've got to win this argument that actually higher duties means weaker defence. And I suspect there are some good things that we can do around economic security. And of course, we've got a shared interest with America in persuading the Chinese, the Germans, the Japanese to actually kickstart consumer spending, because that's good for American exports. It's also good for our exports too.
Liam, this studio is a kind of great big honesty box. And I did wonder whether you had selected defence spending as the area that would be cut if tariffs came in, because you know perfectly well that's the one thing that Trump cares about. He doesn't care about our welfare spending. He doesn't care about our education spending or our health spending. He does care about our defence spending.
He does. And look, the reason that I picked that out is because he's put pressure on Western economies to pick a number, a percentage of GDP that we move our defence spending to. But if our GDP is smaller, then a percentage of a smaller GDP is going to be a smaller defence spend. And we've run some modelling that we published through the Times today that shows that by 2029, 2030, that could be about £2 billion less on defence. So higher duties, weaker defence. And I think actually that could be an argument that cuts through.
Let me come to the other big area that we haven't really talked about properly this evening yet, amazingly, which is Ukraine. Kim, you mentioned it just now. Lord Darragh, you mentioned it. What is your instinct?
I have much evidence of this, except that Keith Kellogg, who I knew little in my time in Washington, who was in the National Security Council then, is his envoy now in Ukraine and has talked about an extended sort of fact-finding mission and that kind of thing. And just fact Trump isn't talking anymore about solving this suggests to me that he's at least realised it won't be actually very, very straightforward. The other thing about it is I think in his second term, he must know in his heart of hearts he's not going to get a third term, not going to change the constitution for him. And I think he will think about his legacy and his place in history. And there is quite a good argument there that he does not want to go down in history as the man who lost Ukraine and who gave Russia a bridgehead to get into the rest of Europe. I think that argument was made to him by David Cameron when he was there a few months ago. And others will be making the same point to him, and it may be making an impact.
And do you think that, despite the fact that somebody like Tulsi Gabbard, seen by some American politicians as a Soviet asset or a Russian asset, has been put into such an important position?
Well, let's see if Tulsi Gabbard gets her Senate approval. I think she's one of 2 or 3 at risk. And I mean, he's rewarding her because she basically has crossed the aisle. She was a Democrat, has now become one of his biggest supporters. I think the American intelligence, from my experience, can look after themselves and won't be too influenced by what Tulsi Gabbard thinks and says. But you're right, she is. She does have said some astonishingly pro-Putin things. So we'll have to wait and see. I mean, nothing is going to be predictable about this second term.
It's going to be sort of very bumpy. I said... talking earlier on, I thought this is no longer, actually, is it, Liam, a foreign policy story. This is a domestic story in this sense that Trump and to a certain extent Elon Musk are going to be inside our heads for the next 4 years. This is somebody we're going to be looking at the entire time and who will have hugely consequential impacts on British policy too.
I think so. I was about to ask, actually, Kim, whether you thought that putting someone on Mars was part of a new foreign policy that President Trump was going to deliver on. I'm not quite sure, but maybe that's an example of what you mean, Andrew. No, I mean, I think President Trump there focused on the 3 I's of American politics, inflation, immigration and identity. In a way, those are the 3 mainstays of populist politicians around the world. But I think it means for the UK that we've just obviously got to do everything that we can to maintain that transatlantic alliance, which has seen us so well over so many decades. But it is also going to be crucial that we redouble our efforts to draw closer to some other allies, including our allies across the Channel in Europe, and the new allies who we have joined forces with through a trade treaty called CPTPP across Asia Pacific too. So if we are to become this global hub that still continues to champion free trade, then it's really important that we redouble our efforts to build those trade ties and ties of defence and trust around the world. And that's why we've got Nick Thomas-Symonds, the Minister for the EU, and Douglas Alexander in front of our committee tomorrow to talk to them about just this.
Very, very interesting people. Lord Darragh, the cultural aspect of all of this, we had a very, very strong passage in the speech about how there's only two genders and that's now our policy completely, and a nod towards the anti-vaccine people. These kind of positions are going to affect us, aren't they? Because they're then amplified by Elon Musk and X. They become part of the British political conversation as well.
They will. And all this culture war stuff is certainly, it's designed to appeal to his base, to give them some red meat to chew on. And it will affect the debate over here, no question. But crucial thing here, Andrew, he was elected because the economy did better in his term than it did in Joe Biden's term. And whether it was Joe Biden's fault that inflation went so high, you can argue about it, but people voted for Trump primarily over the economy. And so his big and most difficult tasks are going to be keep inflation down, especially if he imposes tariffs, to keep factories or get factories reopened. All this stuff is going to be very, very difficult. And in the end, the red meat of the culture war stuff, will keep his base, interested for a while, but he's got to deliver on the economy and jobs.
This has been a day the world has changed, however, hasn't it? Everything feels different after today and after that speech.
Yeah, and it's been coming for a while, let's be honest. And you can see it in the results of populists and their elections around the world over the last year. You've got a world now that is fragmenting.